Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Let's say that two people, like clones of each other, were given the same task. Because they are clones, they would have the same knowledge and, theoretically, the same ability. Let's assume that they had the same ability. Both of them are given the same task. Who is likely to finish the job earlier and better? This problem doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? They're clones. They should both be working exactly the same. It's you and your clone. Both of you should end up with exactly the same result. But that's not how it works. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The unexpected power of the second last minute deadline. Not the last minute deadline, the second last minute deadline. What is this second last minute deadline? A second last minute deadline is as it sounds. It's not the last minute. It is something that comes before the last minute. It is an artificial deadline that is close enough to the final deadline, but not quite the deadline. Let's assume you're recording podcasts like I am right now, and your deadline is Thursday, right? So that's a fixed deadline. That's also the last possible day that you could record the podcast. So this is like, that's it. You don't do it here, you did. And that's how I tended to proceed with this podcast for years. When we started it in November 14, that was it. It was like, you start writing the script, you do all the stuff that you need to do, and then by Thursday it has to be done. Because then you have to edit it, and then you have to put music to it, and then by Saturday it has to go up. And so Thursday became that final deadline. But it was also very crippling as a deadline. I'd finish off on Thursday, and then I would do all the editing and stuff, and then by Saturday it would be done, and then the whole sequence would start all over again. Again, Sunday you're thinking about it, Monday you have to do some outlining, and Tuesday you have to write really quickly, and it became this frustrating thing that would drive me crazy. I would drive Renuka crazy. I just couldn't focus on anything but that crippling deadline, and it would show up week after week after week. And this is like a problem that you would have with any deadline, but when you have a recurring deadline, it gets even worse than before, because you have to write a blog post, or you have to write a newsletter, or you have to do a podcast. And writing those 4,000 to 5,000 words week after week, that was very stressful. I could meditate for half the day and my mood wouldn't improve. The first thing to understand at this point in time is that the second last minute deadline is not going to help. I simply didn't have that ability to go from an 800-word article, which was what I was writing before I started the podcast, to 4,000 words or 5,000 words. So the first thing that we run into is this factor of ability, and we have to get to that stage. So that took me 2.5 years before I could just sit at the computer and then be confident, yes, this whole podcast of 4,000 words, it's going to be out easily. Not with all that strain and screaming, and I wasn't screaming, but you get the idea. It was frustrating. Now, if you were to take your situation and say you could write 200 words quite easily, but then you had to write an article of 800 words or 1,000 words or 1,200 words, and you would go through this same kind of scenario, which is you would struggle for a long time to make that leap, because 200 words is not the same as 800 words. A one-day workshop is not the same as 3 days workshop. And so there's that gap. But eventually, most of us, if we keep at it And if we learn and if we train ourselves or we get training from others, then we get to the point where we are quite fluent or reasonably fluent enough to cope with that new situation. At that point in time, we still stick to our deadline, not to the second last minute deadline, but to the deadline. So that's what I was doing. I had trained myself to always get my stuff ready by Thursday. And so once I got that ability to handle those 4,000 to 5,000 words, at that point, I didn't change anything. So the pressure didn't go away. The pressure stayed on me the whole time, as it stays on most of us. And in October 2018, I just got fed up of this situation. It had been 4 years since I started writing the podcast. It was repetitive, this constant having to cope with this week after week. So I decided, okay, let's make this a second last minute deadline. And I didn't approach it in the right way. What I did was I wrote 2 scripts of 4,000 words each. And so that was the equivalent of writing 2 podcast scripts, which was double the work and therefore double the exhaustion and double of everything. But I was done. And that meant I was free for the following week. Instead of taking it off, again, by Thursday, I wrote 2 more scripts. So now I had 2 weeks free. At that point, something amazing happened. That whole burden that I was feeling, that just slipped off my shoulders. I was the same person, that same clone, Sean and Sean clone, but now the pressure was off. And the moment the pressure was off, I was able to write podcast scripts all the way to December. So from all the way from October to December, it was in there. Then we put in some reruns all the way to Jan. Now, what I'm saying here is that I approached it in the wrong way, and this isn't something that you should do and something that anyone should do. What should have been done is it should have been 1 big podcast and 1 small podcast. So let's say you're writing a newsletter, then you write a smaller newsletter. You have a blog post, then a smaller blog post, an extensive cartoon, a smaller cartoon. And that takes the pressure off because now you're still delivering, but you're delivering a smaller version of it. And the audience, they love it anyway. In fact, audiences like that contrast, that mix. I didn't do it that way. You should do it that way. That's what I do now. I mix it up a lot. Because there is no rule that says that your podcast has to be 4,000 words or 5,000 words, or that your cartoon has to be 17 panels. It could be 2 panels. So you have a shorter podcast, you have a shorter article, you have a shorter newsletter. And if you've been doing this for a while, then have some reruns. We've been having reruns for Psychotactics for years on end. Now we've been running since almost 2000. And so we've got articles and we run those. And that takes the pressure off. Just be clear about one thing. By Thursday, I'm still putting out stuff, but now it's different. I know there's 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8 podcasts probably in the queue. The same thing applies to the articles. The same thing applies to all the stuff that we're doing. Essentially, what you're doing with this second last minute deadline is you're still keeping to that date, but you're taking the pressure off. And you definitely become more productive. You become more creative. For instance, I'm recording this before we go to Munich for the Info Products course, and I finished the presentation. And so I've got 1 week and probably 3 or 4 days, and I can go through that and tweak it and change some animations and add in some videos and do something, or even edit stuff that's not valid, not important. That would not happen if I had to finish it on the 4th and the presentation was on the 5th. And so there's this myth of the deadline, that without the deadline you get nothing done. But the truth is that the deadline is actually crippling, and that having a second last minute deadline is the way to go. There are situations where it goes wrong, where you don't have the ability. That is something that you just have to get over. And underestimating the amount of work, that's common. We do that all the time. So yeah, you might still head towards the deadline because you've underestimated the amount of time and work that you need to put in. But finally, if you decide, okay, that's the real deadline, this is a fake deadline, nothing's going to happen. And you're going to have that pressure. So let me leave you with one sobering thought, that if your name is Maria, Janssen, or Anita, that you could have a clone exactly like you with the same ability, and yet that clone would do a better job if they had a second last minute deadline. Try it. It works. It takes the pressure off. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. What did we learn? Well, we learned that there is going to be a point where we don't have the fluency, we don't have the ability. But at some point in time, we will have that ability. And if we can just slip in one extra piece of work, that takes the pressure off. And then the next week, we keep to that deadline. We never let that Thursday go. And then you start creating so much stuff because you feel free. So try that this week. Do one big piece, your normal piece, whatever it is, the blog post or whatever, and do one really tiny piece and slot that in for next week and see how it goes. And now that we're done with that, let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. If you've been listening to the podcast, you know that there are 2 live courses, as in online courses happening. They're handheld courses. One is the cartooning course, which is called Da Vinci, and the second is the headlines course. The Da Vinci course teaches you how to become a cartoonist, which is fabulous. This is also a very freeing thing for a lot of people. Once they realize that they can draw cartoons as well as pretty much anyone that they see out there, like real artists, it is amazing. It's an amazing feeling for them. So that's at psychotactics.com/DaVinci, DaVinci. And that's on the 22nd of June. That's the date that you have to register. The 29th of June, on the other hand, is the headlines course. And you learn how not to get stuck with this headline the whole time, how to write 8 headlines in 10 minutes, 8 astounding headlines, 8 curious headlines in 10 minutes. That's a precise result. At the end of the course, you do that and you can see exactly how the headline is written, and you can audit anyone's headline in any field, which is fabulous because at the end of the day, you want a result. You don't want more information, and you don't want to cut and paste headlines. You want to be able to write them like you speak, like I'm speaking to you right now. I don't have to go and check, oh, am I making sense? No, I know I'm making sense, and you can write super curious headlines and 8 of them in 10 minutes. Go to psychotactics.com, get on the waiting list, and 5000 BC members have first preference. So preferably we'll see you in 5000 BC. That's me, Sean D'Souza, saying bye for now at the end of this very short podcast. Bye-bye. Still listening? You probably heard this before, but we also do this with our packing. When we're getting on a flight, we take a break every 3 months and go somewhere else. But usually I'll do a workshop. It's not always, but usually it'll be a workshop. So right now we're going to Munich and then after that to Greece for a holiday. And there is equipment to be taken, like recording equipment and computers and wires and USB-C and USB-A, and it's all this stuff. More and more wires. But there's always this fear when I get in the Uber that I've forgotten something. So the best way to do it is to pack 4 days in advance. So instead of that mad scramble of the last minute deadline, we have the second last minute deadline. And there are people that can't be saved. This is not for them. I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye.